And welcome back to Frankly Speaking. I'm your host, Frank. Let's call this volume 16 of the Integralist Chronicles. Okay, guys, I haven't done one of these in a while. Um, I generally do one of these when something jars my memory. Integralist Chronicles is kind of my journey through life and how I came to be a Catholic integralist and how I view the world, my experiences, my stories. I'm going to be 53 years old at the end of this month. And, um, you know, like everybody else, I have my experiences. And that's why I love history, because in many ways, we're all historians. And while we can sit down and read books, and I do lots of that, as you guys know, um, the other thing we can do other than read books is define history and how we all lived it day by day, year by year, decade by decade. And in many ways, Integralist Chronicles is exactly that. It's my story and how I've seen things, what I've experienced, the life I've lived, and I share with you all to kind of get you to help you understand, how it is we're of how I see the world and how ultimately I believe a some type of an integralist Catholic society is really the only answer to the problems of the world. In fact, it's the only form of sanity that I believe that I've ever experienced, being from a Sicilian background and being a child of two worlds, as I've always talked about. On one hand, born and raised as an American boy, on the other hand, culturally within my home, being raised by two immigrant Sicilian parents. And I have this unique perspective of the new world, the liberal new world that I was born in and raised in, but also the old world of the values that I was raised with in my home with my parents, and the experience of Italian culture and Catholic culture and family, extended family, everything that comes with it. And so tonight, I was kind of sitting around. I was just relaxing a little bit, and it's late at night here right now. It's what time is it? About 1 in the morning right now, actually. I was about to go to bed, and I was just kind of cruising through YouTube and listening to some old music from the 80s. I'm still a guy that's still stuck with music back in those days, and um just kind of cruising along, listening to some of the oldies that I used to listen to when I was a kid. And I noticed a a video from about a year or two ago of what was it, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inductee. And they were inducting the Go-Go's into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, right? For those of you guys that are about in your 50s, I'm sure you guys all remember the Go-Go's. They had the hit song "We Got the Beat" to the raunchy sort of growing up movie, coming to the age of, adolescence and adulthood movie, Fast Times at Ridgemont High. I remember that movie well. That did a lot of damage in my mind when I was a young man, or a young boy, I should say. Um, and they did songs like Vacation and Head Over Heels, and they were an all-girls band group back in the late 70s throughout the mid 80s, and they were absolutely pretty huge, actually. Um, and they were being introduced into the Hall of Fame apparently a year or two ago. I don't follow stuff anymore. I don't really listen to too much secular music anymore. Sometimes I just reminisce about my youth because I have fond memories. But Drew Barrymore was doing the introduction, and I put it on for a minute, just kind of reflecting back and um, you know, reliving some of my childhood memories. And as Drew Barrymore was doing the introduction, her, what do you want to call it? Her worship of the Go-Go's, because she was a young girl where she expressed her feelings of how the Go-Go's was the very first band she ever listened to. And I gotta admit, the Go-Go's might have been my first band when I was a kid too. It was right there. I think I'm about 3 years older than Drew Barrymore, so we're right in the same age. And I do remember the Go-Go's very vividly. Um, as a kid. I mean, it was just part of pop culture at the time. And while she's kind of doing a whole shtick and honoring them, and it's all this praise and this glory, and it was over the top, to be honest with you. While I can appreciate the art that the ladies did, there's also something deep and dark about Hollywood and the music industry and all of that comes with it. And I could not help feel but sad because, as I said so many times, this was that era where we were coming out of the sexual revolution that started in the 60s. Start to go through the 70s where morality starts breaking down. And then by the 80s, as a culture, as a society, we're lost. The fact that we got the beat, their hit song was the opening theme song again to Fast Times at Ridgemont High, really sums it up in a microcosm where we were as an American culture at that point, as it was a pretty raunchy movie, really aimed at teenagers, and all of the problems that we have today in many ways can be stemmed back from that era. You guys know I've talked about things like Three's Company. That was a pretty damaging show at the time to sort of help facilitate the breakdown of culture and family, the porn industry becoming mainstream on VHS in everybody's home, soft porn through cable TV, and a bunch of other raunchy movies. And the 80s was pretty famous for these again, these films that came out in theaters and eventually into the VHS that always had the sexual thing in it, ultimately to try and break down the morality of our society. There's a lot of those movies in the 80s. It's funny because maybe because porn is so mainstream now and it's everybody's, fingertips. I know that nudity, I don't think is as prevalent as it once was in mainstream sort of cinematic films anymore. I know it does exist, but in the 80s, it was pretty much standard as a form of shock, as a form of, we're going to catch people or we're going to bring people in by using the nude scene in a film. Because again, pornography was not as simple as our phones and in those days, and sex had an attraction. Nudity in films had an attraction at the time and had a place to kind of get people out into the theaters and eventually to get them to either rent or buy the films on VHS tapes. I think because now porn is so mainstream, that's how much we've broken down that nudity isn't necessarily as big of a thing in mainstream sort of cinematic films. And I think that's kind of died off a little bit, right? But in the 80s, it was big. And in many ways, the Go-Go's, with their music, I don't want to say representative. That's not the right thing to really say. What it was an all-girls band. They liked to rock out. They had some catchy tunes, without a doubt. But I watched the documentary on the Go-Go's, and I guess what I'm saying is it's all symbolic of the era and where American culture is really starting to decay by the 1980s. And I remember specifically watching a documentary on the Go-Go's, a few years back, and you know what could you have with an all-female group, right? Pop stars, world tours, you know, ladies that are into the ways of the world and everything that comes with sort of being, again, famous in the liberal society. You can only imagine. And watching the documentary like I did, I was really saddened by their plight, even things that they admitted themselves. Because what comes with fame and sort of that Hollywood glory is the sexual license that these young ladies partook in. Drugs, sex, abortions were part of their thing in order to help deal with their careers, right? Having the rock and roll lifestyle, having the parties, the affairs, the adulterous actions, the drugs behind the scenes, the abortions, like I said, as a result of the sexual license that sort of comes with that Hollywood, sort of famous, glory, liberal society that we live in. And it's actually kind of sad because I think it's more of a common story than what Hollywood oftentimes really lets us know. And I think it's coming unraveled. We know more and more now. I think it was Stevie Nicks, right? You know, Stevie Nicks, famous female singer. She was another one that came out a few years back and admitted having sort of a guilt complex, I believe, if I remember correctly, because she had 4 abortions while she toured or while she pursued her career. And she has some regrets about that now. But of course, you know, being a what do you want to call it, a star singer, a pop star singer, you know, your career, your concerts, everything that you do, well, that demands your time. You can't focus on things like family. And I guess that's the point, is that, you know, these things of the world, these career paths that many women choose, they come at a cost, they come at a price. Um, and of course, under the guise of individual rights and freedom and liberty and everything we do in America, really there's nobody to set things straight anymore in our society, to, you know, kind of discourage, have a societal norms that tell young ladies, wait a minute, listen, I get it. You want to be rock stars. It looks good. It sounds good. You want to be famous, you know, the ways of the world. But at the same time, you're going to lose out on another part of life that most likely will have more meaning for you long term. And this has led to all the broken lives in our culture and our society, facilitated by rock and roll and Hollywood, that has helped sort of, you know, be a terrible influence on society in general. You know, it's like I did that video on Madonna. Oh, the Papa Don't Preach thing, video that I watched, and I did a video on that, did a cast on that a few weeks ago. And, you know, Madonna, you know, from my opinion, you know, with the whole Catholic school girl routine, you know, she was sent out there. I mean, obviously to corrupt boys with sexuality, the seduction that Madonna portrayed publicly as a pop star, without a doubt. I remember her very vividly as a boy, but also to seduce young ladies, and to help break down sort of these barriers of morality, um, that Madonna always constantly attacked. And she did it from that sort of, like I said, that kind of like that Catholic schoolgirl thing in a way, because she always tried to play up that Italian thing, and she always wore crucifixes. She did the controversial video, like a prayer, with, you know, the blasphemous act with Jesus coming down from the cross, that was very controversial in the 80s. And so it's, to me, it's very telling about what liberal society has become. And in many ways, American society, based on American principles, has done it to itself. It's American society collapsing in many ways because of the faults of its own broken philosophy of individual rights and sort of extreme, um, you know, freedom without a social construct of the faith, culture, family, bloodline, everything that seems to bring honor and respect to society. We have none of that. We have none of that, right? We're the other half of the sort of, you know, material dialectic coin. You know, on the one hand, we have communism, Marxism, on the other half, we have capitalism and democracy. And you know, this is why American culture has been gravitating further and further to the far left, why we can't get a hold of any of this anymore. The morality, the, you know, the music, the movies, the porn, everything that infects the mind with vices. And watching this tonight, seeing what once were these very attractive young ladies of a band that I grew up watching as a kid, which were not the best influence on me, but, you know, I was part of that, you know, everyday culture. Yeah, you know, it's funny because, you know, I don't really call myself a traditional Catholic because I don't really know what that is. I've always considered myself a Sicilian Catholic because that was the faith of my parents. And when my parents well, my grandparents really immigrated here. Of course, my parents did too when they were very young in the 1960s. I just don't think many of them were prepared for what a liberal secular society was going to throw at you. You know, we had this promise of religious liberty. If you're Catholic, you get to practice your faith in America. But Catholicism, with an overarching liberal society, what we've learned is it doesn't work very well. And honestly, a lot of those immigrants that came over didn't understand what American liberalism was and how it would eventually corrupt all their kids. And so my point is, you know, my first exposure to what we call traditionalism came online. And as you gravitate to a lot of these traditionalist communities, you see these Catholics that, you know, come off as very, what do you want to call it? Puritanical, I guess you want to say. And I don't use that as a negative connotation, right? I mean that in the sense that there seems to be a great amount of trads that at least verbally and publicly display their faith with great affection and great devotion. And it's a faith where if you expose any weaknesses, they will come down and hammer you if you call yourself a Catholic. And so it's kind of strange, right? Where it's like, okay, we got all these Catholics, and it's one Catholic couple, they practice the faith perfectly, and of course they have 12 kids, and if you don't have at least 12 kids, you're not really a good Catholic. And they sit around and they have no TV in the house because they're the perfect Catholics, and you know, they sit around and read books about the saints 8 hours a day, and then they 4 hours a day they read the Bible, and then they go to Latin Mass, and they're super duper holy kind of a thing. Now, listen, I'm not trying to bash Catholics, not what I'm trying to do. What I'm trying to portray is that there's a real world out there. And maybe there's Catholic communities that have cloistered themselves, cut themselves off from the rest of the world, like the Amish have, or something like that. But I don't know that world. When my family got here, we were in LA. We were part of everyday life. Most of us went to public school and we experienced everything of the culture all around us. And as the liberal culture deteriorated the faith and the morals, we were thrown into that world. And a lot of us created a lot of disorders based on that world. And because our parents didn't understand a lot of this coming from the old world, they didn't know how to fight it. They didn't understand it. That was the strange thing about it. So when the Go-Go's or the Madonnas or the Michael Jacksons or the Princes came out, oh, okay, well, it's American society. It's music. It's music. Now, of course, you start to pick up on some of it. It's wrong. You know, obviously when Madonna's doing things like a virgin, okay, well, that's a signal. It's like, okay, well, what is this, right? When she's doing, again, the Like a Prayer video with Jesus coming down from the cross as a blasphemous act, you're like, okay, maybe this is a problem. When Prince is doing concert and he's butt naked in bathtubs and concert, like, okay, well, that's not normal, right? I mean, you eventually start to pick up on it and you're like, okay, now what? And then by the time, you know, we're here experiencing this new liberal world, we're picking up on it. But at the same time, your kids are going to school. And the Catholic schools were breaking down just as radically as the public schools were when I was going, you know, growing up in LA in the 1980s. And you get to a point where you're just enamored. You're swimming in the culture, the secular culture with the Protestants and the Jews and everybody else around you. You throw in pluralism and diversity and all the intermixing of races and culture, and you got this true melting pot. And maybe some Catholics have been successful in isolating themselves. And like I said, reading stories about the saints, you know, 8 hours a day with the candles instead of the electricity and no TV. That's fine. And God bless you if that was your world. I just wasn't raised in that world. In fact, I've never known any Catholics raised in that world. We all had to fight this liberal behemoth, this liberal culture at the end of the day. And many of us in those days got sucked into it, especially when we were young. And in many ways, our parents got sucked into it too. Because even as a parent, this thing becomes overwhelming. And I saw parents in the 80s and 90s start to give up I remember when the Italians started to pick up under the nefarious liberal society and the nefarious liberal culture. Many parents were fighting this stuff in the 70s and the 80s and even through the 90s. But as things broke down, right, illegitimacy and shacking up out of wedlock, and your kid comes home and says he's gay all of a sudden, all this stuff beats down on you. It beats down on you because there's no cultural reinforcement. There's nobody to back you up in this society, because liberalism, American liberalism, these Enlightenment principles say freedom, liberty, individual rights. And who can argue against individual rights? So, it just, I was watching this and it just reminded me of a time where I began to see the entire breakdown of our culture, of our society, of our civilization, just a period of history that I lived through. I'm sure those that are older than me can even go back even further and give us even more examples. But being that kid that was born in the 70s, raised in the 80s, really getting the meat of my cultural indoctrination throughout the entire decade of the 80s, I saw the progressive breakdown of culture and society. And, it's funny because you see things like this, right? You see these things from your past that you were enamored with, right? That was part of the culture. You grew up with it. You went to school as a kid. Everybody kind of watched the same TV shows or kind of listened to the same music. You share these fond memories, these moments, and it's part of your life, whether you like it or not. It is. And so when I hear like a song like "We Got the Beat" by the Go-Go's, it resonates, right? We got the beat, right? It hits. It hits the soul in many ways. But it's like a double-edged sword, right? Because that with that comes a lot of moral crisis that's always been associated with a song like that, or with groups like that, or anything that we did in the 80s, and because that was part of the breakdown. The devil plays a role in that always, and uses whatever means secularism in order to break down the morality. And the question is, if you were raised in that and it kind of still touches you because that's what you remembered, that was part of your culture, your society, your upbringing, is it wrong? Or should I say, if you are still attracted to that because that's what it was, that was your life, is that wrong? Is it wrong? Right? So when I look at a group like the Go-Go's, who I know have, partaken in order to fulfill this career and this music that they've put out, that they've partaken in all these nefarious actions in their lives, what Hollywood calls. And listen, the news stories about the darkness of Hollywood coming out every single day, they're horrifying. They're horrifying. And these stories are all the same, right? All these Hollywood stars that go through these moral breakdowns, drugs, sex, rock and roll, abortions, multi-divorce, abuse in one way or another. You see it all. You see it all. And you ask yourself, okay, am I supporting this because I'm still attracted to this music because it was part of my childhood, it was part of my upbringing, it's part of everything that I knew in society. Now, obviously, we got to reject it to a certain extent, right? Like I told you before, Madonna, it's not allowed in my house. My wife just won't allow it for it to be played. And listen, I'm not suggesting that I listen to any of that stuff. I've rooted out of my life, right, as well too. I was a big Prince fan in the 80s, and I just don't listen to that anymore. But when it does cross, sort of, or come on in the car when I'm driving the radio, you take a moment, you're like, okay, I remember the song. It's part of my childhood. It's something that hits the soul in many ways, right? Whether it's for good or for bad, obviously, most of the time with a guy like Prince, it was bad. A movie like Purple Rain was completely damaging to my generation. I remember that film very well. It was damaging to my heart, my soul, my mind, with all of the sexual license that was involved. But this is how we were all conditioned. This is how the breakdown of the family and the culture happened. It happened with music. It happened with Hollywood. It happened with the music videos. It happened with, all these secular things, apart from the faith, all in the name of freedom and liberty, and all in the name of individual rights. So as I was watching tonight, I thought the glorification of this celebration of introducing the Go-Go's into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame was, it was overdone. Don't get me wrong. The glorification of a female rock band, but it was still part of my life when I was a young man, and it hits you, where it counts, because that's what you know. That's how you were raised. That was your era. That was your generation. You don't get away from that. And when you're, 10, 11, 12, 15 years old, you really don't know any better. Unless you have parents that are really actively involved. But see, that's the point, is that most parents are overwhelmed by this culture. And most parents are giving up. And most parents don't want to be, the parent that says, no, you can't listen to that. No, you can't go to that concert. They don't want to take your childhood away, because this is what growing up in a secular liberal republic is. This is how you partake of a greater cultural society, unless you lock your kids away to such a degree that, I don't know. I don't know. Yeah, I just look at the liberal West today and I see it as just trash. It is such a godless trash culture that it robs us of all of our innocence. It robs us of our moral principles. It robs us of everything at this point. I don't want to hear about the claims of the economic engine of prosperity and look at all the wealth we have. Yeah, well, some people have that. Most people are indebted for a lifetime, and they'll never escape that debt system, that usury system that we've created. Most people will always be cogs in the system to support the plutocratic class, the upper classes. That's what they'll be. So I don't know. I guess what I'm trying to say is that I grew up in an era where it all began to break down. I grew up in an era where there was a massive transformation from the morality and the culture and the society of my grandparents to my generation. I saw everybody within my generation absolutely ruined, broken morally. Everybody, all of us were. Like I said, I'm sure there's a few people that might have escaped it, that had different circumstances, maybe grew up in a part of the country that was still more innocent. But for those of us that grew up in the major cities, there was no escaping it. I saw nobody escape. I saw lives ruined everywhere. And just like I said about, the Go-Go's, this all-female group that went through their trials and tribulations with all this moral depravity that comes with the Hollywood lifestyle, that really transferred or transposed over to the general population. I saw friends, boys, girls, all do the drugs, all do the sexual license, all do the pregnancy, the abortions, the contraceptions. And as we got older, the divorces, the broken families, saw it all. I think some of us escaped it later on in life because as you grow, you mature, you realize some of your mistakes, you want to settle your affairs and settle your issues, and with maturity you want to settle down. But then it comes, in many ways, how do you go about that, especially like with something like marriage? Because if you find somebody who's broken, and not willing to go through the trials and tribulation and understand that something like marriage is a sacrament from God, if they haven't been secularized to such a degree to where they see marriage as simply a contractual obligation that can be broken at any time. Because that's the other thing I saw is rampant divorce in my generation. I mean, there's so many issues. There's so much human brokenness because of liberal society. And most of us don't even understand how, even just going back to our grandparents' generation, it was a different world. They lived with the life of honor, duty, respect. Now they lived in a much harder world, at least from a material perspective. And maybe that's the problem, right? Maybe we've had too much material wealth. It's made us too comfortable. I know I enjoy the comforts. I know I do. And I know for it, I'm I probably got some things to change in my life. I always do. I'm always doing an examination of conscience. But the radical transformation of Western culture since the 1960s is something that I don't think we've really ever dealt with. And as families continue to break down, the idea of relationships and how we form relationships continues to break down. Less and less people are becoming interested in that. They view it just as another generation with, oh, well, they were just prudes, that kind of an attitude. When in fact, I think that old world, there was a lot of wisdom there that they tried to pass on. But nefarious forces within the realm of politics, finance, interest groups, culture, they were determined to break down Western morality. Because the moment you break down morality, the family soon goes with it. And in the moment the family breaks down, you've just enslaved everybody. Family was always the bedrock of civilization. I know conservatives like to say that in America, but conservatives really don't know what family is. They've capitulated left and right because they understood what family was. They would take different approach to a lot of different things. You know, it's like the story I've told you about Limbaugh, who was supposedly a conservative, Rush Limbaugh. He had this thing where if you're not 18 years old, or if you are 18 years old and you're still at home living with your parents, there's something wrong with you. You got to go up there in the economic and your prosperity and kind of, boom, take life by the horns and go make the money, the money, the money. If you don't do that, you're lazy. Okay. I get it. I understand it to a certain respect that struggles will make you more ambition at times. But there's also a world of great immorality out there. The purpose of the family is to protect you. First line of defense is the family. This is why I believe marriage is such an important institution. I do believe in actual young marriage because you leave the protection of the family, of your parents, of your mother and father, and you transition into your own family now you're creating. You throw an 18, 19-year-old out into the real world, go rent your own apartment, go to college, do the sex, drugs, and rock and roll thing like is a rite of passage in America today. What's going to happen to those kids? They may get a good job, but like the Go-Go's, like I said, the Go-Go's, and sort of the rite of passage, the experience that it takes to be a star rock band in this world. The drugs, the sex, the rock and roll, the divorces, the abortions, everything that came with that career. What do you think happens with kids when you throw them out into a liberal society, 18, 19, 20 years old, without any protection of the family and the moral principles that the family was always designed to protect their offspring with. What do you think happens? It's a very dark, deceptive world looking to take you down. And this is how American society is broken down. This is how the culture is broken down. This is how the family has been destroyed. And now it reflects at the political level. And you got American conservatives scratching their heads saying, I don't know what happened to America. This isn't the America I know. Well, you gave the cultural Marxists all the power they needed to destroy your family, destroy your culture, and to destroy your country. Because this altruistic idea of freedom is not the freedom of God. Sorry, it's not. I know Glenn Beck is trying to sell that. See, I believe as a Catholic integralist that there's nothing wrong with social structures. There's nothing wrong with certain limitations if they're balanced with proper natural and moral laws. The natural law and the moral law given to us by the church. That's the counterbalance. Oh, but that's right. The classical liberals ousted the church and made religion into an individual right, a personal choice. Because authority contradicts the principle of individual rights. You see where we're at? You see the contradiction in that? Because the moment you say, wait a minute, maybe we need a balance between individual rights and sort of the collective values of a society. Oh, now you're a communist. That's what they'll say, right? And the communists on the other side take the other extreme measure, right? As the classical liberals in the West say, it's exclusively individual rights. The communists and the leftists will say it's exclusively collectivization, right? For the common good. And as Catholics, we've always preached a balance between the two. Yes, individual rights are important, but there is a common good, right? But then, of course, you'll have a guy like Glenn Beck say, yeah, but, if we take away the bad freedoms when we're in power, then when the bad guys get in power, they'll take away the good freedoms when they're in power. Therefore, we can't have the common good at all. It's all about individual rights. Come on, Glenn. Come on. You're a child. You're a sophist, is what you are. If we can't balance individual rights with the common good, then society is doomed, because the common good is a real thing. And there was always a counterbalance to extreme collectivization. That was the natural law. That was the moral law of the church. But it was your forebears, your classical liberal forebears, that decided to kick the church to the curb. They abandoned the faith of their ancestors, becoming de facto atheists. You could tell me, oh, they believed in this quasi-Protestant, blah, 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 me and Jesus. But look how Protestantism has evolved. Protestantism, as E. Michael Jones says, is a pathway to atheism. Look at Northern Europe. Look at the Protestant Maginot Line, the Protestant Reformation Maginot Line. All those nations have apostatized. All of them. Look at all the offshoots of the British Empire that rebelled and stole the lands of the church. Look at them. America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. They're some of the most liberal nations on the face of the planet. Because you all said that we can't balance individual rights and the common good. The Catholic nations figured it out. And of course, the Protestant nations didn't like that, and then they had to take out the Catholic nations through bombing campaigns, right? That's the interesting thing about it. But at some point, guys like Glenn Beck and other conservatives have to answer the question. We've gone down the path of extreme individual rights. Look where we're at. Look where we're at. We're in a post-Christian secular society. Let me ask you a question. Is individual rights part of God's plan of salvation? If it is, then God has failed us. Look where we're at. When are conservatives going to answer? When are classical liberals going to answer for the absolute decimation, collapse, destruction of the West? When? These are all your guys' principles. When are you going to answer for this stuff? You say, well, no, it was the communists that if, hey, another creation of the Enlightenment. And you guys continue to give them power through individual rights. That's the irony of it all. So at some point, guys, we have to get serious. I've been preaching this for years now. There's no election coming to save us. There's not. Anyways, the Go-Go's, we got the beat, Vacation, Head Over Heels, all catchy tunes. But they were also part of that culture and that society that began to break down everything we have in the West, especially in America. And they were part of that rock band society, rock band culture. And I love that rock stuff. I love the sound of it. I'm a good old American boy in that sense, right? But that music was all destructive. It was all destructive. It poisoned the hearts and minds of my generation. All of it. But what can you do, right? It's individual rights. It's individual rights. It's not like we have a moral authority that says, wait a minute, this stuff isn't good. Let's try and save our culture. No, 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 no. We're going down in flames with our individual rights. Freedom, baby. Hoorah. There you have it, ladies and gentlemen. I want to thank you for joining me. Volume 16 of the Integralist Chronicles. I'll talk to you later, guys. This is Frank signing off. Good night, everybody.